One of the things that you realize as you look at many of the stories, particularly of the Old Testament, is how many of them center around the need for ethics in the relationships that people have with other people. Of course, Jacob and Esau is one example of Jacob cheating his brother and the difficulty of their relationship thereafter, and eventually Esau forgiving him. But then Jacob and his father-in-law Laban had the same kind of relationship where they were trying to cheat each other. Joseph, of course, and his brothers and all the jealousy that they struggled with. Later on, Joseph and Potiphar's wife who tried to seduce him. You also have Jochebed protecting Moses in violation of the law, looking after her child even though it was illegal. You've got Samson and Delilah and that relationship that ended quite badly. You have Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi, and eventually her husband-to-be Boaz, and that family dynamic. You've got the priest Eli and the difficulty of his sons that the Lord put to death because they were so wicked. You have David and his relationship with Saul, which was troubled. David and Jonathan, which was a great friendship. And then, of course, David and Bathsheba, which was a disaster. And David and his eldest son Absalom, who rebelled against him. David had a lot of issues with the people in his life. And then, of course, you could also look at people like Esther, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego dealing with governmental authorities and their role there. You get this feeling that relationships and how we interact are very important. And our text today will highlight that idea in very specific instructions. So let's take a look at chapter 3 of Colossians, beginning in verse 18. It says this: "Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord." Paul has been focusing for some time here in Colossians on the majesty of God, of our responsibility to God in that relationship. But our responsibilities to God do not preclude our responsibilities to each other. Our relationship with God enhances the need that we have to interact on an ethical and honorable way with each other. And so Paul is going to talk about a variety of relational situations and give advice for each of them. He begins by talking to wives. Wives are, of course, those who have entered into, some of them willingly, some of them not so willingly, and some of them joyfully, that role that God designed in the marital covenant. When God looked at Adam and said, "Man, you are not going to survive on your own. You need a helper." I'm paraphrasing slightly, but that's the gist of it. God said Adam needed some help, and so Eve was brought into the picture to be that help. And so we're talking to those who have, in Eve's footsteps, entered into that relationship. Paul says that they should submit themselves, and I know that this particular passage and several other ones that are of a similar vein are controversial, and some people don't appreciate them, and some people use them as a sledgehammer. The word that Paul uses here, the Greek word that we translate as submit yourselves, is the exact same word that he used earlier when speaking about governmental authorities in the book of Romans, when he tells us that we need to submit to the government. Now, that certainly is not a focus in that case or in this case on one holding or lording power and control over the other. It's more about the need for respect and more about keeping the peace, whether it's between you and the government or between a wife and her husband. And so we are not going to take this phrase and make it something that it's not. It is simply Paul's reminder of the need for both respect and peace in the home. And so Paul says, "Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands." Who is the one that he is speaking to them in relation to? It's the one to whom they've pledged their love and devotion. The other half of their whole. The one person in this world who has vowed that to put themselves behind her. So Paul is asking a wife to submit herself to the one person in this world who is supposed to be putting her above all else except for God. That certainly doesn't seem like it ought to be a relationship where one is taking advantage of the other. And so we certainly hope that is not the case. But Paul asks for that, and he says, as is fitting in the Lord. And that phrase has been often misunderstood. Basically, Paul is not asking women to submit to a man, to any man. He's asking them to submit to the will of God. And that's very different. Something that we all have to do. We all must submit to the will of God. We all must answer to God and to His will every day. If we are believers in Jesus Christ, if we are servants following our Master, we must submit to Him. And so He is not asking for anything that He's not asking of all of us. Ultimately, it is to God that we owe our allegiance. Because we need to acknowledge that God is our Creator. He is the one who has the authority and the right to direct our lives. And that's absolutely crucial. If we do not acknowledge the authority of God over us, then all the rest of our relationships will be off kilter. So that's where he begins. And then Paul says, husbands, love your wives and don't be harsh with them. So now Paul is speaking to the other half of that relationship, to the men who have entered into, willingly or unwillingly, and some more joyfully than others, that same marital covenant. The one that needed the helper. And so Paul says, husbands, love your wives. And I find it interesting that in the writings of Paul, people have over the years been focusing quite a bit on what he says to wives about submission, without focusing much about to what he says to husbands about love. Because one of these two is harder than the other. It is far easier to submit to someone else than it is to properly love someone else. Paul has given the husband the harder task and the more difficult one. Because you don't have to necessarily appreciate or show or have the emotional connection in order to submit. For example, if your boss tells you something to do at work, and we're going to deal with that one in a little bit, you don't necessarily have to love your boss in order to do your job. It helps, but let's be honest, it probably isn't true for most people. Husbands have to love their wives, or this whole thing's not going to work. No wife can submit to a husband who doesn't love her. That's not going to work. And the husband is not going to be what he is supposed to be if he doesn't love his wife. And I find it interesting that he says, don't be harsh with them. Because how can you love someone harshly? Does that make any sense? Could you harshly love someone? It sounds to me like you don't understand what love is if your love is displaying itself in harshness. Not only must husbands be self-sacrificial in order to demonstrate love in their actions, they also need, and this is something that some of us men struggle with, to show emotional warmth, to show affection to their wives. The opposite of being harsh with them. Paul has set forth for the husbands a very difficult task. Elsewhere he expands upon it greatly in Ephesians. But here, just one sentence. Love your wives and don't be harsh with them. Next come the children. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Now he's speaking to the people to those who have been created, ideally, out of a union of husband and wife, ideally out of a union where the wife is showing respect and the husband is showing love. And he says to those children, you have a sacred duty to obey your parents. It's a cornerstone of the Mosaic law that children must obey their parents. And parents are given that obligation to raise their children, to direct them, to instruct them until they become adults. He says, children, obey your parents in everything. And this is one of those things that we understand as we get older. Our parents knew more than we thought they did. They weren't as much the old fuddy-duds and the killjoys that we probably thought they were. With rare exceptions, and of course we're certainly not talking about neglectful or abusive parents here, but with rare exceptions, parents do know more than you do. For one simple reason, they've been alive at least twice as long as you. They've been around. They know what life is about. And so Paul says, children, obey your parents in everything, and then ends it with, for this pleases the Lord. Once again, we're reminded of the duty that we have to each other within our families. It's a reflection of our obligation and our love for God as our Creator. Next, Paul says, fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Now, he didn't say fathers and mothers, he didn't say parents, he said fathers. Not because he doesn't think moms have a lot to do with raising children. In the ancient world and the modern world, moms almost always do more of it than dads. So moms don't get a free pass, but this is a reminder from the way that Paul is looking at these things, that ultimately the responsibility falls to this father. That he can't duck the responsibility of raising the children. And that is certainly something our society and our generation needs to be reminded of. So he says, fathers, do not embitter your children. How would you do that? Well, the easiest way to embitter your children is to be either a tyrant who has no compassion and no flexibility, or someone who is impossible to please. Maybe some of us have a father or a mother like that we felt we could never please them, we could never do right, we were always on pins and needles, always afraid of failure. It's a difficult way to grow up, and Paul says, don't do that to your kids, or they'll become discouraged. It reminded me as I was preparing for this, it's a difficult balance to walk between showing your children discipline and not discouraging them. It reminds me of the way in which my brother, Brian, who was here earlier this summer, sort of threads that needle, or at least he used to with his boys. Now his boys are huge. They're all grown up. But when they were younger, and particularly with my nephew Jonah, when he was a little kid, my brother had a phrase that he used that was a way of encouraging him without yelling at him, of course, without belittling him. It was a way of helping him out. And when Jonah would fall and scrape his knee or something, or have something that didn't go well, he would say to him, toughen up, buttercup. I don't know where he got that phrase from, but he used it enough. I used it on my nephews a few times. It's a good phrase for a boy to be just to show them something without discouraging them, without making it difficult, keeping the situation light, that kind of thing. If, however, as a parent, you make it so that nothing that your kids ever do is good enough, they make it so they can't possibly win, even a naturally optimistic and upbeat child will eventually lose hope. You'll beat it out of them. Don't do that to children. This next section is much longer, and we're going to have to try to figure out how to apply it. Verses 22 to 24. Let me read the whole thing first. It says, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eyes on you to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. This is one of those passages in Scripture that has been abused and misapplied drastically in the history of the church. In particular, this is one of the passages that was used not only in the South, but primarily in the South during the period of American slavery. Used as a way of confirming the validity of the institution of slavery. Certainly not Paul's point at all in this passage, not what he intended, not what he is trying to say, but it was used for that purpose. These are Paul's instructions for people within the church and for how they needed to deal with the society that they happened to live in. If you were in the first century in Rome, estimates vary because it's hard to get good statistics from 2,000 years ago. Maybe a third, maybe as much as half of the people at some point in their lives would have been slaves. So many, many people needed to know, as a Christian, how they ought to deal with that situation should they find themselves in it. And so Paul shares that. Now we can do one of two things with this passage. We can say, hey, that's about slavery. We don't have slavery anymore. Skip to the next verse and pretend that there's nothing in it for us. Or we can do something that I don't normally do and I don't normally like to do, and that is try to decide and try to look and see if we can stretch this passage and the application of this passage to something that does exist today. And that is, of course, the relationship between an employee and an employer. They didn't have very many corporations in the ancient world. They didn't have a lot of businesses where people worked. Most people worked in a family business. They would not have had this kind of relationship between an owner and an employee, between a manager and an employee. They wouldn't have had it. They would have had this one between a slave and a master, but not that one. So let us read this passage in light of that. It's not authoritative, but I think it speaks well to us as we deal, because most of us are on the employee and not the employer end. It speaks to us about how we ought to act and how we ought to be in the workplace. Now the first thing he says then is that there is a level of obedience that is required. Now, Paul is certainly not saying that as an employee, if your boss says go out and kill somebody, you have to obey. If your boss says cheat the customer, you have to obey. If your boss says file false paperwork with the IRS, you have to obey. Obviously, he's not saying that. When the commands are moral, as an employee, as someone in that relationship, we need to do it. Paul talks about the person in authority as an earthly master. He puts that adverb on the front, an earthly master. And that will become important in the next verse. So hold on to that thought, the thought that they are an earthly master. But he says we ought to obey in everything. As with all of our relationships, as with all of our duties, if they don't cover all of our behavior, then they're not effective. If we only apply these things in part of the time, it's not going to work. We need it in all portions. Paul says not only when their eye is on you to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart. We know that God sees all that we do, that God is aware of all of our actions, but other people aren't. Most of us understand this. At work, whatever that happens to be, you can get away with some stuff. You can cut this corner, you can get away with that, nobody's looking, nobody's keeping an eye on you, you can fudge the time card, you can do a variety of things in order to cheat your employer. Paul says, don't only be a good employee, only be a good person in this relationship when they're looking. Do it all the time. Because obviously, if we are only doing it when it's advantageous to us, that is not moral and ethical behavior. Paul says, do your work with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Our attitudes matter when we follow the commands of the Lord, and they also matter in how we interact with each other. And in this particular place, they matter how we interact at the workplace. Our heart and our attitude matters. Paul, of course, is applying this to slaves when he says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart. But I think it is not a stretch at all to apply this to us as employees. Whatever we do, work at it with all our heart. That is, of course, imitation of God, because God showed himself in the beginning as a creator, as someone who worked. And when he put Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, he didn't set them aside and say, you've got nothing to do, just chill. He gave them work to do. That was before the fall. That was before there were weeds. That was before it was difficult. He said, you still have work to do. Work is imitation of our Creator, and we need it in our lives, whether it's a hobby if we're retired or a career that we're trying to follow. We need it. And so Paul says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart. Now, that's not easy to do. It's not easy in your crummy, blah, blah, blah job that you don't like, where the conditions aren't good and your boss is a jerk and your pay's not what it ought to be, yada, yada, yada. It's not easy to do that job with all your heart. It's not easy to do it as working for the Lord. Can you work at McDonald's as for the Lord? Can you work at Walmart as for the Lord? That's not easy. Can you work at Rocky Grove Elementary School as for the Lord? If you don't, you'll lose your sanity real quick. I understand that. Been in the educational field before. We need to figure out how to do it. It's not always easy. It's not always going to be enjoyable, but we need to figure out a way to find that kind of peace and that kind of harmony in our jobs, in our work, whatever it happens to be. Paul says, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. In the end, the work that we do here in this world is not about our paycheck. It's not. It's not about the task that we are doing necessarily, the widgets that we're making, the things we're doing from point A to point B, the numbers that we're crunching. It's not about that, the emails that we're sending. That's not really what it's about. It's about doing our task here on this world as for the Lord, and we will be judged based on all that we do in that respect. Did we work hard? Did we do our best? Did we have a good attitude? Did we help people? How did we act? How we treat other people in our jobs? We will be held accountable for it. Our fellow workers, our customers, our bosses, whoever we interact with, we will be held accountable. And if we are obedient to the Lord, we will receive an inheritance. Paul says, in the end, it is the Lord Christ you're serving. And that's certainly something that slaves would have needed to hear, because they had a very difficult situation. And I'm sure many an employee feels that they're not much more than a step above being a slave because of the way that they're being treated. We need to act as if we are serving the Lord, because He is the head of all of these relationships. Any pyramid, any chart that we make showing relationships of responsibility, at the head is Jesus Christ, who is both Savior and Lord. He is the head over whoever is the head over you. When you get to the top of the chart, there is the Lord. And so ultimately we serve Him. Whether we acknowledge it or not, God is God and Christ is Lord. And this is, I think, a reminder to everyone. Husbands, wives, children, employees. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs. There is no favoritism. Rewards and punishments regarding all of our relationships in family and in society will be repaid for. Good for good, ill for ill. We will be judged in how we interact with other people. And then lastly here in this, Paul says there's no favoritism, which I find refreshing, because we run into favoritism all the time. We run into favoritism in our family. How many of you were the favorite child? Raise your hand, right? Will, yes, the favorite child. Absolutely. Some of you are convinced that your sister or your brother was the favorite child, and they are convinced that it was you. I have seen that firsthand. I know that it's true. We have favoritism at work. People that get promotions that don't deserve it. People that get away with murder but don't, when you follow the rules. We are awash in favoritism in this world. But with God, there will be none. God won't look at you and say, oh, you're my nephew's kid, so therefore you can arrive late to work. Paul's not going to say that. Or God's not going to say that, and Paul's not saying that here. There is no favoritism with God. And then lastly, he flips it around and deals with the people that are in charge. Masters, provide your slaves what is right and fair, because you know that you have a master in heaven. We said before that Paul said they were but your earthly masters, and this is where that comes into play. Because even the person with the resources and the wealth, the person in charge, whether a slave owner back then or a business owner now, whoever that person is, they still have a master in heaven. They still answer and will answer to God for how they treat those under them. Because the relationship obligations that Paul is speaking about here go both ways. Husband to wife, both ways. Parent to children, both ways. Employer to employee, it goes both ways. The obligation does not flow in just one direction, where you do everything for them and they do nothing for you. It doesn't work that way. So those who have people working under them are required by God to provide for them what is right and fair. That is certainly a difficult question. What is right and fair? We have a term in economics today called the living wage, a wage that you can survive at. That ought to be provided by an employer. Safe conditions ought to be provided. An environment where there isn't harassment or abuse ought to be provided, etc., etc. This is an obligation. We have much debate in our society about capitalism and government regulation. And you know I'm not going in that direction, but the Word of God says that those in charge who have people working under them are responsible to provide for them what is right and fair. If you look at the law of Moses, there were many obligations on landowners and how they treated those working for them. It was a two-way street. And so, if you have an employer who is not treating you rightly and fairly, if that is something that someone in your family is dealing with, that doesn't mean they can cheat them, that doesn't mean they don't have to be a good employee, but it means that employer is doing wrong in the sight of God. And we certainly can advocate for and encourage people to try to find a place to work where they are treated right and fairly, because they deserve it. It is what God intends, because ultimately they have a master in heaven too. So in the end, wives, husbands, children, employees, and employers, all are under the authority of God. All will answer to God for how they act in this life toward each other. So a simple question: how will God evaluate the way you interact with those who are above you, with those who are below you, and with those who are on the same level as you in all of your relationships? 3 quick words of application as we wrap this message up. Number 1, we all have duties and responsibilities in relation to our family, in relation to our work and society as a whole. None of us are without them. We all have them to varying degrees. Secondly, God will indeed judge how well we fulfill those obligations. They're not optional. You have them, they are yours, you will answer to God for them. And then lastly, that being the case, we have them, God will judge us for them. We ought to get busy doing all of them, interacting in all of those ways, in all of those things, in ways